Are we able to talk about this book, Grave Error? As you pointed out at that panel, it is one of the most popular books in Canada right now. It is becoming very quickly a bestseller. And for better or worse, I think it's important that we talk about it. When you started hearing about this book, how did you feel?
It was reminiscent of the first time that my parents started teaching me about residential schools. The anguish that this book has caused, even just to my family, is pretty dramatic. And I don't have a very large family. The rest of the First Nations people who have been affected by this book so far, you can feel the passion, you can feel the pain, you can feel the frustration in their voices when they talk about this book. I would recommend that anyone who is interested in hearing about Indigenous response to this book to go and watch the meeting. I think it was from the start of April of 2024 of this year, the city council meeting from Quesnel. It's on YouTube. You'll get to see several chiefs talk about the book. You'll get to hear many residential school survivors, many elders, many cultural leaders talk about this book and the effect on it on their families, and the effect of the schools on their families and on their community. And this book is causing a lot of this divisiveness, and it makes me a little bit sad, but I think more fearful that this could cause a really big divide between Indigenous people and a very significant portion of the rest of the country. And I've been excited for these last few years of doing work in local government and regional government, provincial, federal, to be able to forward topics on Indigenous rights, Indigenous culture, Indigenous education, Indigenous language, Indigenous land, all these topics that I've been so passionate about in forwarding. I see some of them stalling now because of this book. I see the forward motion is slowing down. I see in Quesnel that some of the bands won't even work with the local government there now. And this is something that we're only at the tip of the iceberg regarding this book. It's going to continue as the book spreads across our regions, our communities, our country. And I really hope that we can get ahead of this in some way in regards to education, in regards to support networks. That was my first reaction to that book.
My suspicion is I felt that this has been coming for some time now. And the reason that I feel like it was eventually going to come is because one thing that they do say that I agree with is that there was a moral panic. And there was an initial reaction to the 215 that went global. And you just can't even imagine anyone being able to ask any questions during that period of time. There was no, well, how many are we sure? What was the evidence used? Like, that wasn't the focus. And perhaps it shouldn't have been. At this time, we're coming to realizations as a country, and we need to reflect on that and take that in, that a lot of people were learning about Indian residential schools for the first time during that 215 discussion. And so there needed to be a space for that. But when I look at land acknowledgements, I don't like them, because what I think they do too often is they force people to say things they don't understand, they don't care about, and they can get resentful around that. Some people, like, I see them put it in their email signature. I see them say it at meetings, and they'll be like, I am like to declare the unceded, and they are not engaged in what they're saying. And when you get people to start to say things that they don't believe or they don't understand, you start to get that resentment. Why do I have to do this? Or like I've seen people say the name wrong and they're trying to learn how to pronounce a First Nations word, and then somebody goes, "You're saying it wrong, like you're doing that wrong." And then people go, "Whoa, okay, I thought I was doing the right thing here. Now I'm getting called out. Now I'm upset, and now I don't want to participate." I had concerns about that because I'd watch professors in my university do it and not care about what they were saying. And it's like, we don't want that type of reconciliation. We want people at the table who genuinely want to be there. And then there has been very little discussion about the complexities of Indian residential school. Certainly the overwhelming feeling of everybody I know was that Indian residential schools were horrible. But I do have a few people that I know who have been able to share their family's experience, and it was somewhat what they describe in the book. Now, I think what they did in the book is over-exaggerate everything positive about everything in there, but it's almost a reaction to the overwhelming narrative that has existed. And so to me, the book isn't surprising that eventually the silent minority was eventually going to speak up. And this speaks to so many people who are tired of land acknowledgements, tired of feeling like they're settlers on land that their great-grandparents have been on for a long time. It's a reaction to that. Do you see what I'm saying, or do I sound like I'm out to lunch?
No, I can definitely see what you're saying. The way that the media grabbed hold of the 215 and spread it across the country or even internationally was very quick, and it likely was a little bit calculated in the way that it was spread to be very fantastic and very extreme. And unfortunately, that it was a fantastic topic and an extreme topic. It was something that our country and the rest of the world needed to see and to hear. Could it have been done with a little bit more insight and after a little bit more research, and perhaps after the bans had decided how they would go about examining any evidence that they were finding? Definitely, it could have been held back and done a little bit more appropriately, a little bit more accurately, a way that the topics in this book wouldn't exist. But that wasn't, unfortunately, that wasn't the way it happened. So now we have these topics where we're still in the process of gathering evidence, where we're still not completely out of the dark, information wise. And I don't know why this is such a major issue. I recognize that not having the evidence being tangible and being examinable is something that is extremely attacked in not only in this book, but on a lot of the articles of the authors across all their platforms. But the reason that this is because the bans are in complete control of how and when this information will be gathered, uncovered, and released. And they're taking into account very important things such as the actual residential school survivors, the families of the people who passed away, their cultures. That these are topics that they have to take into account before they just decide to start digging and to find what's in there. That there's so much nuance to how this is to be done that we are being a little short-sighted and a little impatient when we want to see the evidence now, when we want to know whether the arguments in this book are valid or not. And to be honest with you, this book is not important enough. This book is not powerful enough. This book is not significant enough to force the hand of the First Nations bands to do this any quicker. This is to be done on the schedule and on the healing time of First Nations people, not on the demand of people who want evidence, not on the time of people who want to cause divisiveness, not on the schedule of people who want to undermine DRIPA, who want to undermine UNDRIP, TRC, MMIW, who want to discredit our strongest Indigenous leaders. They do not get to choose when and how this happens. And I can understand how that frustrates them.
One of the other pieces that I felt was a piece that I actually agreed with them on was that they wrote that 68 churches were burned or vandalized after the 215 discovery. And I don't think that that's ever an appropriate reaction by the populace to start to take these steps. I think that, at least from what I've understood from interviewing a historian, Keith Carlson, that Indigenous people were actually, and this again can't speak for everybody in Canada or everybody in BC, but within the Stolo region, were very interested in Christianity because it solved some community problems, one of which was arranged marriages within our region. This was a different path. This meant love could lead rather than arranged marriages and forced marriages. And so there were pieces of it that were really insightful and valuable to cultures where they were willing to adapt to their belief system for it. So I disagreed with the 68 churches being burned or vandalized. I understand where people are so frustrated, and when they look at the church as the place that led the way on so much of this horrific stuff, I just don't think that type of violence is the answer. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. Violence should rarely be the answer to anything. Burning of churches does not raise us above the topic. I feel this was probably a pained and traumatic and knee-jerk response to the information that they were finding out about. That it's not a reaction that I would take or condone. However, this is a different topic than what's in the rest of the book. This is one of the many times in the book where they take a factoid that is actually not significant to the topic that they're talking about, but there's a line between the two, and they try to overblow it so that it is the topic, and it makes it so that they point out one wrong thing, a big wrong thing, don't get me wrong, a wrong thing about a response to the topic, but not about the topic. You'll see this rinsed and repeated through the book, where they take a tidbit that is related to the topic but not the topic, and then throw a magnifying glass over it, or take a quote or a factoid that is about the topic, magnify it, and then state their opinions on it as if it's part of the fact. And so I agree with you that these weren't good responses. Burning churches is not the way to go. But if we're talking about the book, then the talking about the burning of the churches is wrong, but it's not significant to the 215. It's not significant to the residential schools. It was a response to these topics.
One of the parts that really grossed me out was the way they talked about us yet again. Being impoverished and illiterate was just, how do you write this in a book? Like, how do you say this about a people? Like, were we millionaires with Bugattis? No. But were we rich in our culture, in our sense of community, in our connection, and living off of the land? I would say yes. And part of the reason that Indigenous people find themselves impoverished today and over the past 150 years is very much because of the Canadian government. Like, within, again, this territory, we had the Douglas treaties, where they had anticipatory reserves. They gave space for Indigenous people, for them and their potential children. So they were larger sized reserves. Then Joseph Trutch comes in and he minimalizes all of those up to 90% in some cases. And so the land in which we inhabit is so much smaller in many of our communities than what was supposed to be. And to say that that is our own fault, I think is incredibly inconsiderate and irresponsible. And then to talk about our literacy rates, we were some of the best communicators because we came from an oral tradition. So we may not have had a focus on writing, but that's not a consequence of us not being interested in writing. It's that our whole culture was predicated on a different style of communication than other ones. And it doesn't make theirs better. Like, I wrote a whole paper on this in law school. The problem with the process of writing everything down, although it's often held up as the best path, is that what you end up with is people who don't know what Shakespeare meant, who have a Bible and who have never read it, who have all of these books that they've never actually opened. The benefit of an oral culture is that you pass everything that you know on verbally through stories and through connections over time. And so there are advantages to an oral culture. The downside is that you don't have that documentation, that 200 years later you might not have something written down. So what was your reaction to some of the rhetoric about Indigenous people in the book?
In regards specifically to what you're talking about being impoverished and uneducated, these are school systems and economic systems that we were displaced into, and we've only had 150 years to react. I'm sure we both know many First Nations people who have excelled in the education system, who have excelled in business, who have excelled in politics. These type of growth, they take time. And I believe that we're on a very positive trajectory in this regard, especially as we have leaders much like yourself being willing to utilize their education and utilize all the time in their day to ensure that their people have all the opportunities that they can get. 150 years is just a blip in the time of our people in Canada, in the country now called Canada. And I think you'll find that when you double that amount of time, these rates of poverty, these rates of education, the numbers will be dramatically improved. And I just want to point something out really quickly, that I believe that the last stats I've heard on illiteracy in Canada is that 1/3 of our country has a reading level below grade 8. Less than 5% of the people in this country are Indigenous. Like, I'm sure you can correlate those maths to each other, to that it's not Indigenous people in our country that are lowering the literacy rate. And I want to read that paper that you wrote in law school. If you could forward it to me, I would read it for my own education. So thank you.
Fantastic. The other really heavy part is around the word genocide. It's been talked about, I think, by many different people, and I think it ultimately is very complicated, and I don't know if there is a correct answer when we're having this conversation. They point to the fact that the statistics of Indigenous people, of the general population, actually increased over the past 150 years. That we saw, I think the numbers are around 150,000 Indigenous people 150 years ago, all the way up until like 1.4 million in 2021, something like that. And so to their argument, if it's a genocide, you would expect to see that number drop. During the Holocaust, you would have seen the numbers of Jewish people decreasing, not increasing. The word cultural genocide has been used. There's different terms around that idea that the removing of our culture had health consequences. I think you might see that the statistics of genocide, of death rates among Indigenous people being incredibly high in comparison to the population, which would go to the point that it is a genocide. Speaking from my own experience, my grandmother had many children, and she was hurt in her heart from the experiences in Indian residential school. I don't think she was the best mother to those children. And those children had worse health outcomes as a consequence of that. So many of these things are being passed on, and this is where it leads into this idea of intergenerational trauma contributing to many of these issues. How do you feel about the term genocide being used in this regard? Do you think it's accurate? And do you think they're just playing statistical games when they say that our population actually increased over the past 150 years?
Definitely statistical games are being used. As I pointed out earlier, the authors in the book love to point out a factoid, magnify onto it, add on their opinions as if they're parts of the fact. And they ignore the surrounding facts of that one factoid. Regarding genocide or not genocide, cultural genocide, which they love to point out in the book isn't a real term. Terminology gets created as it's required. If we haven't seen this before, that is why the term now exists. When we talk about cultural genocide, we're not necessarily talking about the loss of lives or the gain of lives or the number of First Nations people that exist across the country. We're talking about the loss of language. We're talking about the loss of culture, the loss of land rights, all of these topics that have been more or less taken away from our people in abundance, not completely taken, but to a point where we're struggling to retrieve them, to have our children learn the languages. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know Nklakatmuk or Secwepemctsín. I don't know either of my parents' languages. And saying that out loud right now makes me recognize that I need to dedicate myself to those topics a little bit more. Because if I can't set that example, how can I expect anyone else to? When they share their views that genocide did not occur or that cultural genocide does not exist, these are the views and opinions of people that are very, very much so trying to cause divisiveness. And we don't need to look much further than that the government of Canada and the Catholic Church have both referred to these instances as versions of genocide. That we have some people who want to focus in on specific facts, twist other facts, and to misinform people by claiming they're misinformed. I don't actually care what their view is on whether they say it's genocide or not. Their opinion on the matter is not relevant to me. When the government of Canada claims it, when the Catholic Church claims it, and when the Assembly of First Nations claims it, that I'm sated.
What were your feelings? I know you've read like a majority of this book and are just finishing it. What were your feelings reading it throughout? As someone like I was surprised. I felt like I was going to be able to sit down and read this book, and I had a feeling I was going to know some of the positions and understand, but the taste in my mouth that I'm left with is just like a lack of care. Like a lack of like feeling that people's lives actually mattered, and that like we have these stories. Like it also clearly tells me they don't know very many Indigenous people who have gone through these things, because like I can't go into my community and not hear some of these stories come up throughout my day. Like I just can't not interact with some of the very real experiences people had in these places. And I mean, one of the numbers that they put out is $4.7 trillion over the past 150 years that have been given to Indigenous people. Like, does it look like we've got some sort of 4.7 trillion sitting around somewhere? Like, if you added up all of, and again, this is where you speak of like misleading information. If you added up all the money the federal government has spent and all the money the provincial governments have spent over the past 150 years, it would be some absurd number, like $400 trillion spent over. Like, it would be an unruly number that you wouldn't be able to put into context. So I don't find $4.7 trillion to Indigenous communities over 150 years very enlightening as to what that actually looks like. Now, do I think that there's corruption within First Nation communities and band councils not always acting in the best interest of the people? Absolutely. I wrote an article on that. I think that needs to be called out. That doesn't mean it's every community. And even the people who I think are mismanaging their money, they're not millionaires. They're not managing like an insane amount of money. It's still not enough to manage the schools and the systems that we have to operate within First Nation communities. And I say that as somebody who does a lot of this work and looks at the budgets that we're dealing with. So what was your general sense of the book Grave Error?
Yeah, I'm almost complete the book. And like yourself, I thought that I was going to be able to sit down, read it in one sitting, because it's not a very big book and it's not very hard to understand. It's pretty plain language, very, very to the point, very, very populist. The book is a hard read. And it's caused me some loss of sleep. It's caused me some stress through my days. My mother has also tried to read the book, and I'll take a moment to give a quick backstory on that. Both my mother and my father attended the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and as little as 2 generations ago from myself, from my mother's family, we've had people who died at the Kamloops Indian Residential School and did not return home to our families. That I just recently said that in public for the first time at a city council meeting. It's generally not something that I talk about in public. When my mom tried to read the book, it made her cry. It caused her a lot of anguish, and I asked her to just let me finish it and let me shoulder this. And I think it's something that I'm hopeful that our Indigenous leaders, cultural, political knowledge keepers, that if they feel up to the task, that they ought to read the book just to understand the points of view that are out there and against us. The book is causing a lot of divisiveness and hatred to become allowable. And I think that's one of the points of the book, is to give people an outlet to be able to feel allowed to share these views and allowed to share these emotions and allowed to point fingers at people. If our leaders can take this on our shoulders, I would hope that our residential school survivors, our elders, our ancestors won't have to. I don't feel like this is something that we all need in our lives. In fact, I wish that none of us would. And I would ask that Indigenous people who read this book or who choose not to, that they choose not to partake in the hatred that this book is causing, whether it's in response to hatred pointed towards us or hatred pointed towards the schools or whoever they deem responsible for them. I don't want us to be set back decades in our healing, and it feels like that the potential of this book could cause that. My hope is that we can lean on each other in this time, to lean on our cultural leaders, our political leaders, and our knowledge keepers to support each other, to let each other know that what we've gone through has been traumatic, and it has been wrong, and it has caused us so much pain, but that we can still support each other. We can still be thriving members of society. We can still give and receive love, and we don't need to be baited into the hatred, because that feels like what this book is trying to do. It's trying to undermine UNDRIP, trying to undermine TRC, trying to undermine any individuals or governments who want to hold those up. It's trying to slam our greatest leaders, such as Leah Gazan, Roseanne Casimir, Murray Sinclair, and so on forth. We need to continue to view these leaders as exactly what they are. And those are the most experienced and the strongest of us that are standing up for us on a day-to-day basis, doing some of the hardest jobs that we can imagine, and sacrificing all the time in their lives to ensure that the rest of us can live a little bit easier. And I really hope that this book does not achieve in lessening any of their impact and any of their hard work that we've been so fortunate to get to witness over this generation.
What would you say to the authors of this book if you were able to sit down with them and have a conversation with them? Because I think it's important that we remember that we're all just people. We all want love and affection and care, and we might disagree on very important issues, but we're all still just people. We want to come home to a loving family. We want to be financially comfortable. This is all just a human endeavor. What would you say to the authors?
I'm so torn. In one vein, I don't want to speak to them at all. In another, I would love to tell them stories of my family, to tell them experiences of my parents, my uncles and aunties, my grandparents, to tell them names of people in our family that were loved and adored and cherished and did not come back home, to show them the difficulties just from my family's experience, not a pan-Indian experience, but just our personal experiences. And unfortunately recognize that it will probably fall on deaf ears, and that they'll write another article about it. After that conversation, they would probably write an article about me and my family, and downplay the results, downplay the pain, the trauma. So this leads me back to the first vein, where I'm not sure that the conversation can happen, but I recognize that conversations like that need to happen so that we can move forward together, so that we can heal together, so that we can learn together, we can educate each other. Because I see some of the logic in the book. I see some of the brilliance from the authors. And I think that together, so much healing could be done, and so many years can be saved from the need of more healing, because that's what this book is going to cause, is the need for more healing, more time, more reconciliation. And I'm not sure I'm up to that conversation personally, but I know the conversations need to happen. And maybe some of the people that they're so targeted in the book are the people they should be having those conversations with.
One of my big takeaways from the book is the importance of these conversations, because I can so clearly see that they feel like they're being silenced, like that they're not being listened to, that there's no discussion of the other side of the story or other perspectives in it. And so it feels like they picked up a bat and they came out swinging because they want their perspectives to be heard. And I think they leaned very heavily on pushing the politics of it all in order to get that message across. So I don't think that this book was unbiased, but I also don't think that the media coverage of this was unbiased either. I think they have a point in that. And the part I hope they could take away is we didn't do that. That wasn't driven by First Nations people. It's the same thing I get when people go, what am I supposed to call you? Is it Indigenous? Is it Indian? Is it Aboriginal? Is it First Nation? What am I supposed to call you? And I always try and remind people when I get those type of questions, there's no First Nation community sitting around there saying, what should we change the name to this week? We've got bigger fish to fry than that. That is usually the provincial or federal government going, how can we be more politically correct? How can we be more respectful? I know community members who say, I'm still an Indian. It says it on my status card. I don't care what you call me. Like, I still have those family members and they have a point to make. The last question I have on this point is, what advice do you have for people who are going to be picking up the book Grave Error after our conversation and wanting to understand these issues further? What recommendations do you have?
All right. I love this question. For people who are going to pick up this book, I feel like there's a few things that you're going to need to do. You're going to have to also pick up other books. Make sure you pick up books from bestsellers. Make sure you pick up books from Phyllis Webstad, from Bob Joseph, from Jody Wilson-Raybould. Make sure that you're going to ground yourself in knowledge and in caring from authors who have actually experienced these topics, who have either attended the schools, had parents who attended the schools, who have worked with organizations like the TRC or IRSS, who have been part of the governments, who have been trying to move forward from this. And also be ready to deal with the emotions that are going to result from reading this book. Make sure that you have people that you care about you, that you have family members around, that you're ready to take care of yourself afterwards. Because some of the topics in this book are very painful. Some of the views are very pointed, and they're sharp, and they're pointed at you. So make sure you're ready to continue healing after in a very intentional way. That would be my advice. Educate yourself more and take care of yourself.
Michael, I find you to be so thoughtful, patient. I feel that energy of wisdom coming from you. How can people follow the work that you're doing and the impact you're having within your region and the messages you're trying to get out?
Oh, thank you so much, Aaron. Some ways that you can follow me are on, it feels so petty to shout out my social medias after this conversation. No. These topics that we're talking about are so important, and they're so overwhelming that asking people to follow me on LinkedIn feels so ridiculous right now. But you can find me on all the major social medias. My website is michaelmoses.ca. I have a newsletter there. I post every few weeks on the newsletter about positive Indigenous culture and current events. I try to bring some brightness into the world through education and on Indigenous topics through positivity. And I think I need some of that. I need some more of that right now. And I think that the people who will pick up this book also will as well. So come share this journey with me. We can support each other.